Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. I'm not satisfied when I learn something new unless I share it forward. And so we created this podcast to continue that, to share forward the wonderful people we get to meet and most importantly get to learn from and make our lives richer and better. Together we'll cover the human experience. And for me, the human experience is foundational in the idea of relationships. The topics will be far-reaching, but common element you'll see here is it's all about relationships. So I invite you to join us on this journey. Come experience it with us, share your thoughts and ideas, and become part of our community. We'd love to have you.
As we close out Mental Health Awareness Month, we need to remember the conversations surrounding it are a year-round affair. 1 in 5 Americans will experience a mental illness in a given year. So understanding how to manage and care for your mental health is imperative to living a healthy life. Today on Celebrations Chatter, we will hear from a panel of mental health experts. Dr. Daniel T. Willingham, a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, whose research focuses on the application of cognitive psychology and neuroscience to K-12 education. Dr. George S. Everly, Jr., a psychologist at Johns Hopkins Center for Humanitarian Health and a prolific author who specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Joel Weinberger, a professor of psychology at Adelphi College, whose research focuses on the unconscious processes. Together, these accomplished psychologists discuss the current mental health crisis and share actionable tips for how to maintain your own mental health.
I think the discussions have to be twofold. One is identification. The next is what to do about it. Too many times we just stop with identification. And we not only don't help people, in some ways I believe we do them a disservice. That's my 2 cents.
So doing something about it, that's the crux of this whole thing. So we're in the early stages of being comfortable with identification. And now, George, you've done so much work around post-traumatic stress disorder. And everyone assumes that's only from combat, but it's not. You did a lot of work in Japan around the survivors from the Fujiyama nuclear reactor meltdown. You did a lot of work on in a wartime scenario with the civilian survivors of the London bombings. And is it appropriate to bring that lens to this discussion around COVID? Is there a case for a country, a people, a community, a world population having some kind of stress disorder as a result of what we've lived through with COVID?
I think it very much is. I sometimes think in diagnostic terms and diagnostic labels. I'm not sure that that's particularly useful for most people. I'm less concerned with the idea of anxiety and depression. I'm more concerned with what fuels them, what creates it. So believe it or not, the London Blitz and the pandemic have things in common. And it's a powerful psychological dynamic. And Joel and Dan, perhaps you've seen the same thing. The biggest request I get, and I've done 140 webinars in the last couple of 18 months or so, they want to know, how do we cope with uncertainty? Because it's like, when's the next shoe gonna drop? So we use models to help us with that, to take the uncertain and make them certain. So my colleagues and I at the Bloomberg School had written a paper in 2006, and Jim, you know this, where we predicted this particular pandemic, and we predicted the waves and the whole bit. We even predicted—
Uncannily accurate.
It comes on the heading, better be lucky than good sometimes, but
I don't think so.
But we even postulated that it would end the Ides of March 2022. Now, we were not aware of treatment, vaccinations, et cetera, but it was based on history. As I said, as you know, this is my third pandemic, living up close and personal, first in China, then in Singapore, and now here. So it's not rocket science to look at history and say, might this predict something similar? And it did. But no one, Jim, was listening.
I would argue, how could that be, George? How could it be that you were so accurate when we didn't know that the mRNA vaccine would even be available, invented, and so effective? And yet, with all of modern science having seemingly saved us, which you predicted in 2006 came true to almost to the day.
Well, I'll tarnish my crown a little bit by saying we didn't see this next wave coming. Mm-hmm. So now I'm getting calls back from the same people said, okay, you were close. But,
read us the appendix.
Yeah, what's going on now? So it's the same theme, though, isn't it? It's the uncertainty. How do you deal with the waiting for that next shoe to drop? So again, history informs the future. So I was fortunate enough to to spend some time in England, interviewing the survivors of the London Blitz in their 80s and 90s, et cetera. And a very similar thing. When's the next bomb going to drop? The single biggest mistake that the English made, the British, was they took their children out of London. So they took them out to help them survive, obviously. And that makes sense. From a public health standpoint, perfect sense to me. So I interview this guy who happens to be a world famous psychiatrist now. And he was one of those kids. And he said, when they put me on the train, I thought, what have I done wrong? Why am I being punished? Okay. So they try to explain it to this 6-year-old kid or however old he was. But then they realize the bombing's not going to stop. They can't predict the bombing. On some intuitive level, they understand that the greatest thing Homo sapiens have going, one of the greatest things Homo sapiens have going for them is this biological drive to be a community and live and suffer and struggle together. And that will fuel our resilience. So what they did is they went back out in the country, they put the kids back on the trains and they brought them back into town. And my argument was that was the day Germany lost the war.
Fascinating. You know, just a lighter note, a friend of mine, a Brit, last 2 years hasn't been back to see his mom in London. She's 93 years old. He finally gets back to visit her, gave her COVID. So he's calling, he's apologizing, and she says to him, by God, Chris, you become such a wimp. She says, I survived Hitler's bombings. I can survive the sniffles. But it goes back to the question that Elisa and I had been chatting about before this call, which was my father could never admit that he was having a tough time of it. He had to suck it up and get on with it. So Dan, there's always been a generational difference. And Joel, you were talking about a gender difference. It was okay if my mom was anxious, but it wasn't okay if my dad was struggling.
Yeah, so I'll address the gender difference. Maybe Dan can address the age difference if he wants. But we know that the incidence of depression and anxiety disorders is far higher in women than men. So the question is why? Yeah. One possibility is, well, that's just how it is. Women suffer from these things more. But it's probably more likely what you just said, Jim. Men have to suck it up. Men can't admit to it. So they'll act out or they'll pretend they're fine or whatever it is. And women will be more open and honest about it and hence probably deal with it better. And there's another factor, I think, that generationally, I'll throw a little bit just because I remember an incident about my father. He visited me when I first opened my private practice and a patient was leaving and he was coming in to say hello. And he said, is anyone around? Are you safe? Well, this guy's pretty big. And I looked at him, I thought, oh yeah, he is pretty big, but it didn't occur to me that I'm in danger but that's another factor. This guy is off, therefore he will harm me.
Yep.
There's that aspect that and we see that even now in this discussion. He shot somebody because he was mentally ill, as though that somehow explains the murder and mass killings and so on. Oh, well, he was crazy, so I guess it's okay.
We want an answer to things, and it has to be a label. Oh, how could someone do that? Oh, they were mentally ill. It helps us to cope or comprehend, even if it's not accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it feels explanatory, and this question of labels, and I'm glad this came up because especially when we talk about generational differences, this is whatever the opposite of silver lining is. This is the dark lining around something that's basically, when we talk about the benefits of openness, one of the downsides is that there can be almost a faddishness. I'm thinking about school age kids now. I'm thinking about middle school. I'm thinking about high school. I mean, my daughter, I've got 2 kids in high school, and both of them and all of their friends talk about anxiety a lot, and they're talking about it as though it's clinical levels of anxiety. And I really think it isn't. I mean, they're dealing with typical high school problems that all of us experienced. And so this does make it difficult for it. It's another thing for parents to watch out for. I think, when I was in high school, the thing my parents needed to watch out for is no one our age would have known what it was, and they would have had to be looking for symptoms. We would have had no self-awareness and ability to describe it. And probably most of us would have been pretty bad at just sort of introspecting and talking about what we were feeling, much less having some idea like maybe my problem is that I'm feeling depressed or something. Now I think there can be the opposite issue coming up, which is kids are self-diagnosing quite a lot. In my experience,
and here's where the vocabulary matters, because we don't have a sufficient playbook here to help people to self-diagnose or to self-cure. Although it seems to be some trend now. That's going to be the question of our whole discussion today: is okay, what now? What do you do about it? But and technology is going to play a role here, don't you think, Dan?
I think it's already played a role. I mean, the extent to which during the pandemic, people discovered that talk therapy can be quite effective over Zoom. I mean, it's not for everybody, but there are a whole lot of people for whom
it's a whole lot better than nothing.
Yeah, it's a whole lot better than nothing, and really quite suitable for many people. So I think we're already there in that sense.
Joel, your research has been so focused on the unconscious mind. Is that part of the coping mechanism we're talking about here in terms of labels, vocabulary, definitions, and diagnoses? That we look for those quick answers so as to be able to control it, be able to understand it, own it.
Yeah, I think actually Dan can speak to this because he's a cognitive scientist, that we organize our minds in terms of associative networks. So if you hear a word, it depends what that triggers in you in terms of the meaning you'll assign to the word. So if you tell an older person mental illness, they go one place. Dan, you just gave an example. You tell a kid anxiety, that person goes somewhere else. I like to say that anxiety is like fire. You can use it to heat your house. You need anxiety to function in the world, but it can also burn down your house if you have too much anxiety. And I think in terms of vocabulary, what we're talking about is, what does this word trigger in you associatively? You can research that and find out. Just say the word to somebody and see what they come up with, run enough people, and you can map the associative networks. So that's the way I would look at it.
Well, Dan, in your world, what's more overused than the term ADD?
Yeah, and again, that's, as you probably know, Jim, that's been the subject of a great deal of debate as to whether we are become appropriately more sensitive to the fact that there are a whole lot of people who've got a little something going on in terms of ADHD, or whether we're we're overdiagnosing. And the best that I've seen is that a little bit of both is true, and that it has become faddish in certain communities, especially very wealthy communities, for every child to be diagnosed, especially if they're having a little bit of trouble with school, a little bit of trouble adjusting socially. And as you said, it's sort of like helps parents especially sort of partition that off and make an attribution about what's going on. But then in communities that are underserved medically, it's probably being underdiagnosed. If you figure that the rates are probably pretty comparable across geographic regions, you see very high rates in some wealthy communities and very, very low rates in poor communities.
So you know that's not the case. That's just a matter of diagnosis.
Right.
There is a trend to, when in doubt, diagnose it. When maybe 30 years ago, when in doubt, it's probably not there. There are a lot of reasons, social pressures, also malpractice issues involved. So I think about a tripartite formulation. One is where I come from a clinical standpoint and just from a programmatic standpoint, I'm about empowering people. I think we all are. That's why we're here. Mm-hmm. But there are two more pages to that chapter. One is enabling. I fear our society enables some less than helpful behaviors. And then I think there's one more page to that chapter, which is crippling. I think one of the things that I see with social media is that while God bless, we have it in so many different ways, it may be one of the most toxic things I've ever seen at the sociologic level, ripe for misuse and abuse. So the words we use, again, going back to original point, I think they're important. But one of the things that I was struck with, so my first doctoral training was in public health. So, helping at the macro level, millions at a time is the public health point of view, right? And one of the things I was struck with was I've been in the game now 50 years, and I'm not sure we're getting much better at approximating and meeting the needs that are really there. Forget the overdiagnosis or whatever. There's no question there are needs there. And I don't think we're doing a great job at meeting them. So, as someone once said, apocryphally credited to Einstein, the action of repeating an action over and over and over, expecting a different result is a definition of insanity. I don't know whether I don't think he said it, but it's kind of pithy, so we'll go with it. We're doing the same thing. We're training social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists. We're trying to get more and more of them out in the field. We're not succeeding. There are 3,400 officially designated underserved communities in the United States. There are hard to access rural communities. We're just using the same model isn't working. So to your point, what do we do about it? I'm sure there are many things. What I decided was let's go back and reinvent the wheel. So there are data dating back to the 1960s and 1970s that showed that with some focused training, people from all walks of life could be trained to provide some level of psychological support. In 1979, a guy did a doctoral dissertation. I'm surprised I let him graduate, frankly, where he showed that people outside the mental health field could provide acute care psychologically as effectively as psychologists could. And we've seen this over and over and over and over again. That we can train people from the community to provide effective short-term psychological support. And just as there is a EMT, just as there is a paramedic, just as there is a physician assistant nurse practitioner, and there is a physician, all on a continuum. Why can't there be basically people from the community who are trained in psychological first aid? And they're not treating anybody, they're not diagnosing anybody, but they can save lives, no hyperbole intended. And we know how to do that. We have randomized controlled trials saying we can do it and it can be effective. So if we are able, in my opinion, ever able to approximate full universal mental health care and support, it's got to be using something different. So why not draw on the resources in the community? Educators, nurses, firefighters, police officers can be some of the most effective providers of acute psychological support. And, close to home for you, Jim, in my opinion, the best study to come out of 9/11 was the work by Boscarino out of the New York Academy of Medicine, where he showed that basically acute psychological support provided by peer support people was actually more effective than the same time frame support provided by psychiatrists and psychologists in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Well, it seems to go back to what you mentioned earlier, Joel, is I think we've all mentioned so far, which is the importance of family, community, belonging, and the whole loneliness epidemic that has been exaggerated by COVID. It seems like the first element of prevention and first aid is connectivity, human interaction.
Yeah, well, Dan, you know the research better than I, but as far as I know, the longest longitudinal study on human resilience was Emily Werner out of Kauai. She studies kids coming from challenging backgrounds, studies them for 40 years, and finds that those who prospered, who survived and prospered, were distinguished by having a non-parental mentor of some kind and by having a peer support group that was literally supportive, not toxic, not bullying.
Mm-hmm.
And we forget these things, or we don't promote them or something. I don't know what the heck.
I think there are societal issues that we're not addressing here about. I agree with what you just said, George, about lay people being able to help others. I think that's absolutely true. But then if you ask lay people to do it, you're going to come up with a lot of resistance. And I've experienced that. I'll just give a quick story. I was on an airplane a couple of years ago, and they said, "Is there a doctor on the airplane?" I thought, "Oh my God, someone's had a heart attack. What am I?" And then they said, "Is there a nurse?" I thought, "Okay, so there's no doctor." Then they said, "Is there a dentist?" And now I'm scratching my head. Someone has a toothache. And then they had a heart. It turned out, my wife figured it out. Someone was having an anxiety attack is what was actually going on. It didn't occur to them to ask if there's a mental health person on the airplane. It just did. And these are flight attendants. They're trained. If someone hijacks the plane, they're trained if there's a mechanical failure, but they're not at all trained on how to deal with anxiety, which I'm guessing is far more frequent than planes crashing and terrorists taking them over. And then my wife volunteered me, and I'm not sure I thank her for that. But I ended up being able, and I think any of us could have done it. I didn't do anything special. I was able to calm the woman down by explaining what anxiety is about and why she was having it. And they were like looking at me like I had two heads. And just to show you how badly trained they were, they had someone pass up a baggie filled with pills and tried to convince me to give this woman a pill to calm her down.
Pill fixes everything.
Well, I didn't even know what was it. It was a baggie filled with pills. I didn't know what was what, and I'm supposed to give it to her. Then they show up with an oxygen tank. This woman is hyperventilating. You do not give a hyperventilating person more oxygen. That's not a good idea. So they knew nothing. So my point is the education, we may be talking about it, but we're not educating people. How does a flight attendant not know how to deal with anxiety? And then George, you were talking about the firemen and police. I agree 100%, but they've got to buy into it. And society has got to buy into it.
Indeed. And then that brings us to the question of what's next? We hear about really thoughtful scientific people saying that psychedelic treatment is a good remedy for a lot of circumstances. We're in the world now where we speak a lot about the metaverse and virtual reality and artificial intelligence aiding and abetting virtual reality. Might there be some tools that emerge here to help people with diagnosis, self-treatment, and anxiety relief mechanisms?
I'll jump in here, but before I do, I want to, I think we can't let Joel's story go by without noting how weird it is that somebody on the plane had a baggie full of pills. Like, what is that about?
Oh, it was worse than that. They passed the baggie up the aisle and people dropped pills in it.
Oh,
so the pills were from multiple people.
There's the bag.
I love the spirit of community, but like a terrible idea.
It was unbelievable. And they actually tried to talk me into giving this poor person a random pill from a bag. The first aid is not that tough to teach. It's really not. And for some reason, we don't do it.
We can teach that skill in a half a day,
easy.
With practice. And we can dramatically expand the resources in a community. But it has to do, to answer your question to some degree, Lisa, it has to do with culture. Is the culture embracing of the idea that there is a need and there's something that I can do about it? So again, Dan, this is your bailiwick, not mine, but it seems to me we should be teaching children and high school age kids about resilience. The world is so much more stressful than when I went through. It's so much more competitive than when I went to college and graduate school and the like. And I see the effects, and as a college professor, I've seen it get worse. I've seen the anxiety about performance, about not being perfect. And I remember looking out my window of a classroom one day, and there was a community, a very affluent community across the street, and there were emergency service personnel. And so didn't know what it was, a little unusual. I later found out that a high school kid had committed suicide and left a note. And the note said, "Dear Mom, dear Dad, I love you very much. I'm sorry to be such a disappointment. My report card is on the table. My chances of getting into Princeton are greatly diminished. And I did not want to be a burden on the society or have you be ashamed of me." And from what I am told, I did not see the report card myself. It was all A's and one B. And the one B felt that he compromised his ability to get into a prestige school. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, what messages are we sending? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, maybe that's right. Maybe the B did hurt him, but so what?
Yes.
Keep going. I mean, you get a bad professor every once in a while. So shouldn't we be teaching, that's why I wrote that book years and years ago, Resilient Child. I'm not a child psychologist, but I write this book not for frankly, anybody but my children, because the belief was at the time, the world doesn't love my kids the way I love them. They're going to get knocked down, no fault of their own. They're going to be the wrong place at the wrong time. And I was trying to raise a 14-year-old girl, largely by myself. And I was learning. So I was writing things to myself, like how do I do this? And I realized I've got some notes here that maybe other people could use. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of put it together and sent it off to a publisher. And I said, look, truth be told, I'm not a child psychologist. Probably everything I say in here is wrong or against current wisdom, but you know what? This is what has helped me. Maybe it'll help somebody else. So the book, lo and behold, wins the gold medal book of the year in parenting. I had to laugh. But you know, from the mouths of babes. But so
look what it taught you, because you went on some years later to be a pretty good party planner and throwing a bridal shower for your daughter.
Well, you know, that's that to some degree we get pigeonholed by roles, don't we?
Yep.
You know, like, so
it turned out you enjoyed it.
Well, I did, but you know, to add a somber note, my daughter deserved better. My daughter deserved a mother to help her through her wedding, through her pregnancies that would come later on. And I just wasn't trained to do that.
It occurred to me moments ago, we were on the subject of the how vital and helpful it would be if there were more training and techniques for people and how to deal with mental health issues. And the fact that these are not that hard to communicate and not that hard to put in practice, I thought it might be useful for us to sort of go around the room and list one or two that come to mind that we think people might not know about, but would be useful for them to know about.
Excellent idea. Why don't you kick us off, Dan?
I will start. It's in my idea. I guess I should start. The thing I was thinking about, actually, I was thinking about this earlier. I think both George and Joel touched on it, of the role of uncertainty as an accelerant for, or even a source of anxiety. And I'm thinking about summer coming and kids getting out of school. And I think a lot of parents are going to be in the mindset, and I think this is partly right, that, you know, that finally kids can have like a real summer. We thought last summer was going to be a real summer of the sort we're all used to, and then it sort of was, and then it, and so I think they're very much going to want kids to sort of do whatever it is the children want to do. I would encourage parents to also think about having some routine in the summer as well, specifically for the purpose of predictability. I think kids coming back to school has been enormously helpful for them, exactly in this sense of predictability. I know where I'm going to be. I know what I'm going to do. Having a routine, absolutely.
So your suggestion last summer for our community was program your summer, program your kids' days to some degree. You can leave some downtime, but there are certain check marks, and you had talked a lot about, let's face it, the COVID experience from a school-age kids. They were somewhat retarded in their social development, physical development, academic development, and your encouragement then was to program your summer to make sure you're touching on each of those aspects of development, so that when they get back to school, it wasn't just a waste of time summer.
And also that, yeah, so that the children feel good about their summer as well. And to be clear, I'm not advocating being real rigid, and especially not being controlling about this. Mm-hmm. But one way of thinking about it is talking with your child about every day you're going to do something for your mind, something for your body, and something for the family. And you've got decisions you can make within those categories, but those are the checkpoints that we're going to try to hit every day.
And there's so many other good messages you're bringing to the conversation there.
Exactly. Yeah. Make it a conversation rather than I've got everything mapped out for you.
Yeah, I did this on a spreadsheet. Here it is. Go do it.
Yeah. Good luck. Let me know if you've done everything. I'll be checking. And then the other thing I would add to that in terms of routine that's, I think, very important, especially for some kids, is sleep hygiene. And that's already come up in our conversation. Sleep affects so many things. And during the summer, especially as kids get to be tweens, they're in bed with the iPad until 1 or 2 in the morning or something, and then they sleep till 11 and the whole day is kind of gone. And so I've been, and there again, like the strategies empirically demonstrated to be effective strategies are really quite simple. It's I'm sorry, go ahead.
Really helpful, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, and it's kind of what you would intuit. So one is like no screens for an hour or two before bed. And in general, if you know your child that this is that they have trouble getting to sleep, trying to sort of wind the day down an hour or so before. So anything that is likely to get them really worked up, let's have less of that an hour or so before bed. And then parents are frequently surprised to find out having a bedtime really works. Telling your child you really do need to go to bed. And if they're currently going to bed at 1, obviously you don't tell them, okay, tonight it's 9, right? They can't lie there with their eyes open for 4 hours. But slowly, shifting it back 15 minutes. And then as they get to that point, shifting it back another 15 minutes or so, that really does work. So I would encourage parents to think about maintaining, still have a summer, but have some sort of predictability, some sort of routine.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. Joel, what would you add to our list?
First, I want to know how Dan has been eavesdropping on my children and knows exactly how they live their lives. In terms of my advice in the thought about first aid, it sounds simple and commonsensical, but listen with curiosity and interest. We don't do that. People are upset, and we're trying to offer them solutions instantaneously. Do this, try that, do this. How about just listen? Be interested in what the person's saying and care about it. That goes, it's harder to do than to say, but that goes a very long way. And that would be the first step that I would recommend.
Thank you. Dr. George, what would you like to add?
I'll add something, just reiterate as well. I think whether we're dealing with children or just family or just anybody, the first thing I keep in mind is that presence matters. Sometimes just the human presence matters. When we listen to hear, not to respond. We're fixed people. We interrupt people. We say, "Oh, I got a remedy for this or that." I could no. Be present. Sometimes it's called the ministry of presence with a small m. Just the human presence can at least begin the healing process, or at least a de-escalation process. Listen with the intention of hearing, not responding. That's the first thing. Second thing that I try to communicate is that aptitude is something that we have been typically taught to assess as psychologists. How important is aptitude? But what if you don't have the aptitude? What if you don't test well? So what I've shifted to is that fortitude is a better predictor of happiness and success than aptitude is. It'll beat it every time. And we see, I shouldn't say every time, theoretical physics and math aside, but there's the study of the termins, we used to call them termites, the study of geniuses. And what was fascinating is that aptitude was a remarkably poor predictor, subsequent success and happiness. And then I think the third thing, and this may be one of the most healing or forgiving things that I've ever learned, is that it's all about the journey. It's not about the destinations. We live in a society that we're almost addicted to destinations, and we almost consistently are disappointed. So you strive for days, weeks, months, perhaps even years to reach a degree, a something, a milestone, and then within weeks after you achieve it, you're looking for something else. We define ourselves by our destinations, and I think that's not a good thing. I think if you understand that this is a process, this journey of life is a process, Of course, there will be failures. Of course, there will be setbacks. If you define yourself by destinations, then you have failed.
Yep.
But if you see it as a process, then it's just part of the journey. And the journey doesn't end until you take your last breath. And for people who believe in something greater than what we see, maybe the journey doesn't end even then.
That's a whole other conversation I look forward to having with you someday, because it's a question that I'm wrestling with and discussing with friends of mine. I'm thinking more and more about mortality and my questioning about faith and its effect. And so that's a whole other area to go into. But I think you, as a group, just gave us some very powerful tools here. And you remind me of an exercise that I did recently as a result of hanging around with wonderful, thoughtful, learned people like you three guys. And that is, I have a brother, Kevin, and I wrote about this in our Celebrations Pulse Sunday newsletter a couple of months ago. I went to visit my brother, Kevin, who is developmentally disabled, born developmentally disabled. And he lives in a wonderful group home, and it's near our summer home. And I was on my way out during the winter to pick Kevin up. We have a routine. We go and we pick up some things at a deli, and we go to our summer house, which is right near where he lives in a group home. And we watch football, and we hang out, and we talk, and we spend the day together. And I went to pick him up at the group home, and it was clear that he was in a bad way emotionally. And he was really wound up and uptight. Now, normally my routine is I'm the oldest of the five of us. Kevin's the middle brother. Normally I play the paternal role. Come on, shake out of this, but I saw it was different this time. And having spent some time with you folks, it was just he and I alone in the car, and I talked to him about what's going on, trying to get him to open up, and he didn't know. He didn't know why he was in this bad state. And so I said, let's do a little something together here. Let's make a list of all the things that you should be thankful for. And we had this wonderful conversation. It's only a 6-mile ride. And at one point I just pulled over so we could continue it in the car and not break the moment by getting to the house too soon. And I saw him physically change. And I was so glad that I didn't do my normal routine of trying to tough him out of it. And we had one of the best discussions we've ever had. And we had a telephone conversation just recently. He said, I wasn't feeling that good. And I remember that conversation we had in your car that day. And I said, boy, maybe things aren't so bad. Maybe I have a lot to be. And he started listing the things that he thought about that day. So there are exercises we can do to help when we feel we're going down a path. Sometimes we embrace that gloom as comfortable and familiar, but we need to stop ourselves. And I think you have all given us some wonderful thoughts and exercises here to think about how to change our own path. Thank you all for sharing your wisdom with us today. One of the joys of COVID, should I say, is that we started down this path of sharing our thoughts and our experiences as we tried to wrestle with the unknown of COVID. It was therapeutic for me and for us to do that. You've all contributed to our communications in so many ways, and it's part of my need to share forward, that I've shared so much that I've learned from you three and so many others, that it gives us a great deal of pleasure to share you and your wisdom with our community. And it's therapeutic for us. And I know from the reaction we get from our community that it's very important to bring this information to our community for discussion and for learning. So thanks for sharing your wisdom with us today.
We hope that you took something meaningful away from this conversation on mental health. Remember, caring for your mental health is paramount to maintaining your overall health and well-being. Let's review a few tips for managing your mental health. Create routines, including a sleep schedule. Be present and listen with curiosity and intent. List out the things you are thankful for. Remember that in success, fortitude outweighs aptitude. Know that life is all about the journey, not the destination. Thank you so much for listening to this conversation on mental health. We'll see you next time on Celebrations Chatter, and share your stories at chatter@celebrations.com.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to Celebrations Chatter. You can join our community by reaching out at chatter@celebrations.com. And while you're at it, tell us what topics you'd like us to explore here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to share it forward.